1% for the planet is a lot more like, oh, that sounds great. 1% tax sounds like, oh God.
Totally. It's not our marketing tagline.
No.
Right now, we have certified more than 820 million US dollars. And so we're on track to get to hit our first billion in lifetime impact. 1% for the planet is a way in which we're saying capitalism, and we're showing that capitalism can be used differently. It's essentially saying 1% of revenues, instead of accruing to ownership or accruing to just the business, 1% is going to go to the earth. We were founded by Patagonia, like it's part of our DNA, and their role in the movement is to be an N of one, to be a bold voice that's like printing things in board shorts that like most CEOs would never even say. And our role is to be an N of many and to create a movement that can engage companies that are very different from each other, but that share this commitment to the planet. A lot of times people have assumptions like, well, you can't do that. Capitalism is evil and it doesn't allow for that. Solely blaming the structure of capitalism for all our ills, I think, is missing an opportunity to say, hey,
Just one quick thing before we get into the episode. This podcast is brought to you by Ecology, the UK's most trusted climate action platform. They help businesses to reduce their emissions, restore our planet, and report their progress for every step of their climate journey. If you'd like to learn more, check them out with the link in the show notes. Let's get on with the episode. Kate Williams, thank you very much for joining me on the Climate Unfucked podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Glad to be here.
I want to dive right in and ask what part you think nonprofits play in the progress that we need to make on climate and sustainability.
Love this question because this is what I've been basically thinking about for the last 12 years since I've been at 1% for the planet. And basically the way we think about it is that nonprofits play a role where there's not a market, and there's some overlap, but like nonprofits exist to create impact, pursue a mission, create outcomes in places around causes on behalf of solutions that don't have a commercial solution. So they are, beholden to the thing that needs to happen on the ground, protecting a rare endangered species in a way that, isn't yet something that can be monetized and may never be. And so the really important role they play is addressing those things that are outside of the economy. A lot of times those are things that have been, kind of maybe caused by the workings of the economy, but not always. Sometimes it's really just like focusing on issues for which there's not, and maybe for which there should not be a market.
Why do you say should not be a market? That's an interesting statement.
Yeah, I mean, so say use the example of a rare endangered species. To create a market for it would be to place a dollar value on it or a unit of currency value on it. And, in some cases that's actually been a really good strategy for the environment to cost environmental services and then, use that as a way to allocate resources. So like taking the example of like a rare endangered species, you could put a dollar or a unit of currency value on that as a way to kind of create a market for that. And in some cases, like environmental services are valued, and it is a way to allocate resources to positive impact. So I'm not saying that should never be done, but like in some cases that can kind of skew the intent or, force all value to live in the economy when in fact this rare endangered species may be a rare and exquisite species in its own right that we should protect because it's not our right to decide that our actions can eliminate its habitat and cause it not to exist anymore. It shouldn't just be in service of things that we could place a currency value on. And so that's what I mean when I say like maybe sometimes should not be a market, because if we have the concept that everything should be forced into the market, effectively what we're saying is that everything has to have a direct value to us that we can, put money on. And I want to live in a world where we don't think that way, where things can have value that are outside of just the ways they serve humans.
Yeah. I guess there's a kind of spectrum, like there's things that it makes sense to put value on, things that really doesn't make sense. And I've been interested in researching for this conversation how 1% has kind of is occupying more of that spectrum and like using maybe the market-based systems or economy and to leverage the impact that you're trying to create. And I get the impression, because 1% for the planet, which I should actually ask you to like say a bit more about, has been around for like 25 years. And I'm interested like how much using market-based systems has like evolved and whether it kind of started out like that.
Yeah, that's a big
That's a
question with a
big
lot of
question.
parts to it, but maybe I will use that as a way to just describe the 1% for the planet model, because that,
Yeah, that'd be
frames
helpful.
what we're talking about. Yeah. So the way high level, the way 1% for the planet works is that we engage businesses to allocate 1% of their revenues to what we call environmental partners, which is like nonprofits globally, which go by a bunch of different names globally, but those entities that are, operating outside of the marketplace. And so really what the 1% for the planet model is doing is creating an ecosystem where we're, sort of recognizing that there are resources generated in the marketplace and that there's an opportunity, and a lot of our businesses, and we would share this view, would say that there's a responsibility to allocate some of those resources to the solutions that are outside of the marketplace, whether or not those are like directly addressing issues caused by negative impacts of the economy. But, regardless, the marketplace does generate excess resources, and investing in kind of the asset of planet Earth seems to be a really important thing for any future economy. And also, again, sort of back to what we were talking about, just for the well-being of that planet.
Yeah. And so like back to I guess to the kind of like using market-based systems to like I guess in the most in the purest form or the form that people will know, it's like a company generates profit or revenue and they decide out of this is maybe a traditional or old point of view, but they decide out of the goodness of their heart that they're wanting to donate. Like how is that outdated or wrong, and like how does it look like with you?
Yeah, and that's a great way to frame it, because, one could see that like businesses get to just like do their thing, you know, come what may, and then they can take some money and drop it into the nonprofit sector to do good things. And, the two are separate and there's no kind of shared responsibility. And in fact, that's not the case now. I think what we're seeing, and certainly what we're encouraging, is businesses operating in the marketplace have a lot of different levers that they can pull to have either less of a negative impact or more of a kind of solutions opportunity in terms of how they actually operate their businesses. So there are opportunities for positive impact within the marketplace. So businesses, investing in solar panels, doing various activities to, improve their supply chains. And this isn't just for environment, it's also for human rights and other causes. There's a lot of ways that businesses, just staying within their, sector, can make changes. And kind of back to where we started the conversation, because there are still issues that don't exist in a marketplace that need resources to address solutions that can't be solved, by businesses in the marketplace. That's the opportunity to allocate resources to the nonprofit sector. And then, the what we talk about at 1% for the planet, it's an amazing way for businesses to like immediately increase their scope of positive impact, because they can then be like making choices in terms of how they allocate resources to improve their business practices and operations, and also to address issues outside of that space.
I find it interesting that you talk about, or I've heard you talk about the kind of philosophy that paying 1% is like a rent for the planet. Like you pay your employees, you pay your rent. Where does that come from, and like why do people need to think of it in those terms instead of a like I give if I feel good and it's a kind of nice add-on?
Right. I think there's a very different like underlying psychology depending on how you do it. If it's sort of nice to have at the end of the year, if you have some money left over, you're essentially saying, um, those issues only merit my attention or effort when it's convenient for me. Um, and
Mm.
I say that with full understanding, like it's not like bad people are saying I have, extra resources I can give them. But like if you really dig into it, essentially you're saying I don't want to, like, the core thing is more important than those other things. And so like only if I have extra above and beyond will I give. Whereas the revenue model, or essentially making it like a tax, it's like
Mm.
I always have an impact and I always have a responsibility to invest in positive solutions if I truly care about the things I care about. So no matter what, if I have a hard year, if I have a banner year, whatever, I have, again, an opportunity and a responsibility to invest in the solutions that I care about if I truly deeply care about them.
Could you just? I'm intrigued in the model of how it works, because I think some people may have heard of 1% for the planet, and also it'd be useful to know your role and like how that's developed. But like, what does it mean broadly? Can you give like because I think you have impact areas. Like, what's the kind of more detail of how it works?
Sure. So yeah, I described with businesses who allocate 1% of revenues to environmental partners. All of that is kind of held together through these 4 impact areas. So those are just economies, resilient communities, rights to nature, and conservation and restoration. And one of our teams works on uh, vetting all of the nonprofits who become eligible to receive that 1% in our network. So part of what we do is we, are able to have this sort of point of view or definition of what it means to do environmental giving that's sort of addressing issues that affect planet and people. And then we ensure that the ultimate recipients of the business members' giving goes to nonprofits that have been vetted against those criteria. And so, the values of that is one, that we're able to ensure that resources are going to issue areas that, we know matter, and that we've determined kind of fit this. It's a pretty broad definition of environment because it includes a lot of kind of connective tissue between planet and people, as well as, more like traditional straight up environment, kind of protecting the endangered species in the threatened habitat. Um, and then it's also like really great because we can sort of learn a lot about like what nonprofits are doing work in which areas, what businesses are interested in which kinds of impact, how does it shift over time. So there's a lot of interesting learning about kind of what people care about and what they want to invest in, and also where the solutions exist and where there's, opportunities or gaps. So it's quite an interesting model in that regard.
Do you ever find that companies are ask question or wonder or worry about like the effectiveness of the nonprofit in terms of like how much of the money goes to the thing, like if it's protecting pangolins, how much actually goes to like anti-poaching units of
Yeah.
pangolins, and how much goes to like other business expenses? Do you find people worry about that?
Yeah, we do get a lot of questions about that. And the approach we take is to have a lot of sort of knowledge and information about our nonprofits so that fundamentally what we're able to offer businesses is the opportunity to get clear on what they care about and what they want their dollars to go to, and then to select the nonprofits that best fit that. Because in some cases, business might be like, I want every dollar to be able to be directly equated to a pangolin saved, or whatever their thing may be. And so then we could say, great, this nonprofit can do that. This nonprofit here is actually doing the advocacy work that will ensure that, legal protections get put in place. So we won't even need to save pangolins in the future. And so then there's like an interesting choice that the company gets to make. Like in that second case, it's not like $1 per pangolin. It's more of a investment in building a system that's going to protect more in the long term. But that might be a story that doesn't resonate for them, may be a story that's harder to tell, or maybe perfect fit. And they may say, oh yeah, that's actually what we want. So what we really try and do is on the nonprofit side, have the information. Like every nonprofit fills out an impact questionnaire, or if they haven't, they have the opportunity to. And it's super helpful because then we're able to understand how they drive impact. And then that enables us to match that with the kind of matrix of what a company is trying to solve for in their giving decisions.
It's interesting because I guess, I don't know, without knowing anything about the kinds of companies and what they say, my intuition would be that more companies would go, I want to donate where it's going to be like $1 per impact or like on the
Mhm.
ground impact. Do you have to do much education of the companies that you work with to go like, yes, that is going to have an impact, but like, if you want to create a more systemic impact or you want to influence the legal system or something like that, then actually your dollars might be better spent here. How much education do you have to do?
Yeah, I would say, in all of our conversations, there's some education around that. And, the kind of core of that education is one that that we need to do because it's kind of like reinforced by the like cultural zeitgeist, which says that like nonprofits should only get dollars for the pangolins and not have like dollars go to like laptops or staff salaries. And, we feel like really confident to say like, hey, if you want good work done, whether it's like dollar per impact or dollars to a system, you probably really want great, smart staff people who choose that profession because they can get paid to do it. And so we really do have a point of view of encouraging, of course, you should care about the impact that the nonprofit is driving, but you also need to understand and like be able to pay attention to the operational costs that, we don't bat an eye if a company knows that they need laptops and, CRMs and the things that enable the business to do its thing. Nonprofits have those same needs. Nonprofit staff members also need to eat food and buy houses and, have lives. And so we really, really try to encourage companies to have the opportunity to develop that understanding. And then, on the nonprofit side, we're keeping a close eye in terms of how we vet them to ensure that they are appropriately allocating, resources to the work at hand. Because the few stories of bad actor nonprofits where money is siphoned off to expensive cars or things like that are really unfortunate because they kind of can cast a pall across a sector that by and large is really smart, hardworking people who are like magicians at doing a lot with a little. And so we want to create a system in which companies can confidently support those nonprofits with the trust that every dollar is going to be well spent by, smart, committed people who are going to make the right choices for how to get the most out of those dollars.
Yeah. Are there any big misconceptions that you think maybe not necessarily even the companies, but people more broadly, someone listening to this might have about like the the model or like the effectiveness behind it?
Yeah, I
It's
think,
quite
an interesting thing right now is that we were, as you mentioned, we were founded almost 25 years ago. And at that time, it really was this isn't 100% true, but it was much more of kind of a universe in which businesses did business. And if you wanted to do positive impact, nonprofits were where that happened. There was sort of more of a divide. But where we are now, businesses do have a lot of levers within their operations, and there is more of an expectation, that businesses will, you know, make positive changes within how they operate their business. And so it has created an interesting context for like clarifying why do we, what's the role of nonprofits? Because I have had people say to me like, oh, if businesses get it right, we won't need nonprofits anymore. And that does get back to some of what we were talking about. It's like nonprofits are not just cleaning up after businesses, nor are they, just doing things in service of the market. So, we still do need that, but it has created, I think, in a positive way, but it is like a more nuanced ecosystem because I do think there has to appropriately be more thought about depending on what kinds of solutions you want to invest in, depending on what kind of impact you want to drive. Should those dollars be, going to marketplace solutions or should they go to nonprofits? And I would say that's been a, interesting evolution for us is getting more knowledgeable and skilled about that, and then understanding like what does that mean for how we engage with our businesses and how we're able to sort of move our model forward in this changing context, still adding a lot of value for everyone involved.
When you say marketplace solutions, you know, like a business that's doing good, say they're B Corp or they're 1% for the planet and they have a regenerative model, is that what you mean by that? Or is there
Yeah.
something else that
I mean, I think at a like super basic level, it could be things like a company that, was sourcing its energy from like coal-fired plants, shifting to sourcing its energy from renewable sources or
Hmm.
something like that. I mean, those are operational decisions made within the context of the business that have a, significant role to play in what their sort of net impact on the world is. And so those are decisions that can be made, not by in nonprofit dollars. Those can be made like within the context of the business. So then the sort of nuance comes into thinking like, is that enough? What is still needed in the nonprofit sector, which, we're finding with our members, there's still a lot and it's a both and, not an either or.
Yeah. Um, I read about the Planet Impact Fund. Is that what it's called?
Yep,
What
that's it.
what's the what is it firstly, and like what's the reason? Because it's quite a recent development, and I feel like it kind of links to this conversation about like the market forces.
Yeah, absolutely. So we launched that in 2022. So it is new. And it's really essentially the only other product other than membership, this business membership model that we've been talking about. The Planet Impact Fund is the only other product we've created in our portfolio of two things. And the way it works, or actually first just like why we came up with it, we really our business model has worked very well, and it's always gonna be incremental. It's always 1% by 1%. So, our goal to increase the amount of impact dollars that are generated through this model, is always going up by these 1% increments, and they can get much bigger when you have a bigger company and more companies. So there's a lot of ways that we grow that, and we have. Um, but we really were thinking about like, is there a way that we can create something that has more exponential potential that's not limited by that 1% and maybe has some other kind of mechanism. So we landed on this concept and now product of the Planet Impact Fund, and it's set up as a philanthropic fund. So only donations drop into it. It doesn't have investors, but donations drop into this collaborative fund or pooled fund, and those dollars are invested for positive impact through the first 500,000, and this is all in US dollars. The first 500,000 we did in public equities, just to keep it simple, but like highest bar possible of, kind of ESG screening, for, climate and other factors. And then as soon as we got above 500,000, we started shifting into some private investments so we could really even have that like higher contribution to positive impact. So we have a renewable energy fund, a sustainable forestry fund, and a biodiversity fund that we've moved, subsequent dollars into. And then annually, we donate about 10% of the assets under management to a portfolio of nonprofits. So we're kind of trying to connect a bunch of different dots there. So, donations come in and they are invested for positive impact. So there's like long-term like positive impact in the marketplace invested there. And then annually, there's that 10% going to a portfolio of nonprofits that are one in each of our impact areas. And then additionally, individuals or companies can set up individual donor advised funds, which is essentially a way that a donor can drop a bunch of funds into this pool and then they can give from there. So it's kind of like you could set up a small foundation on the platform. And that's been attractive because for a lot of people, they've realized like, oh, I'm setting up this like small foundation or just the way that I do my giving. And it's focused on the environment. But lo and behold, the dollars, when they're not being distributed, are invested in things that are like, driving climate change or things like that. So it's a way to align the values of the giving with the underlying values for the investment.
So that's really interesting. So it's kind of like it's a way to put money like very broadly or simplify. It's right to put money in the system and then use the market, like the stock market or whatever, like a company growing and increasing in value to create more money that can then be invested in nonprofits. Is that like roughly?
Yes, although I say it's more both and, because it's also like
Okay.
we want those investments themselves to be like a valuable impact. So like
Yes.
you know, the private investments, and ultimately as it grows, we'd like to, be able to do even more like a private company that's like, startup, that's totally focused on what could be a game-changing solution. I don't know what that is,
Mm.
but like, so a little more risk, but if these dollars could be used for that, then, the fund is really a mechanism for powerful change at a longer scale. So those donation dollars are, fueling that. And then on an annual basis, and I guess that's something we haven't talked about. One of the things that nonprofits also are able to do is they're able to act now. And so
Mm.
dollars going to nonprofits right now are saying we want to address issues on the ground this year, today. Whether that's like building the system that needs to get built for the future or, saving the pangolin today. And
Yeah.
so having that sort of current, like right now urgency is one of the things that nonprofits are really well set up to do. And so in addition to kind of marketplace outside of the marketplace, like holding both of those things in this fund, the other thing about this fund is it holds different timescales. So every year the nonprofits will get resources, but for the longer term, sort of looking ahead, those invested dollars will keep pushing for change.
That's really interesting. Um, I guess what we're broadly like we're discussing something, and what we're discussing like is broadly maybe how capitalism can be used to help solve this problem. And
Yes.
I'm intrigued, like the extent to which you think it can, like how much of capitalism needs to be changed, and how much of capitalism just needs to be tweaked in order to solve the
Mm.
environmental, climate, social, etc. problems that we have. Do you think?
Yeah. I mean, the way I would answer that question is that I think there's a lot more room within capitalism to do things differently that are better for planet and people than we sometimes allow ourselves to believe. Like we blame capitalism for, wealth inequality. It doesn't have to do that. Wealth doesn't have to accrue to very few owners. There are lots of good examples of companies making decisions to have employee ownership or to distribute profits, to, kind of distribute the wealth differently. And so like that's an example of how, you know, solely blaming the structure of capitalism for all our ills, I think is missing an opportunity to say, hey, what could we do differently? And there's actually a fair bit that could be done differently. You know, do I see ways in which there are, incentives within capitalism that make that challenging? Yes. There is, such a emphasis, particularly when you get into public companies that don't have, anything in their bylaws to counter this, to like maximize shareholder value, the kind of like traditional views of capitalism. But I really do think, and I would say the 1% for the planet community, the B Corp community, any company that decides to, bake commitments to impact into their articles of incorporation, which they can do. Um, those are proof positive that we can make, in some cases, really simple decisions to do capitalism a little differently. Like if you think about 1% for the planet, one way to describe it is a redistribution of wealth. It's essentially saying 1% of revenues, instead of going, accruing to ownership or accruing to like sort of just the business, 1% is going to go to the earth. And so that's like saying we're going to just shift the balance a little bit. And
Mm.
so that's a use of 1% for the planet is a way in which we're saying capitalism, and we're showing that capitalism can be used differently.
I found it interesting earlier that you described it or you can think of it like a tax. And I think that, like, if you were to call it like the 1% tax, I think you would have a very different reception. Like 1% for the planet is a lot more like, oh, that sounds great. 1% tax sounds like, oh God.
Totally.
Um,
It's
do
not
you,
our
do you,
marketing tagline.
no. Do you find that, because you'll obviously speak to chief financial officers, like what's their, because they're like hardcore numbers people. Do you ever find that you get pushback on this? Like, why do we need to? You're effectively giving us a tax, and I think it's also important to mention like what the 1% is leveraged on in that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, we always in our like at the staff level are always like, how do we make the case to CFOs? Because
Mm.
that is the, that has to be a part of it is like what is because ultimately the business case is going to have to be there. Like if 1% for the planet like slowly drives a company into the ground, like I mean they have larger problems, but if it's perceived as that, it's obviously not going to continue. So it has to, any business that is going to stick with it has to figure out how, it becomes part of, at best part of how they thrive, at worst, nothing, it doesn't get in the way of thriving. And we see most companies sort of somewhere on that spectrum. But, I would say what we see and see in our companies, hear from CFOs in some cases is that it's a valuable form of financial discipline, aligning the P&L with the values of the company. And so to really sort of bake it in that way, kind of like forces there to be a sort of discipline around it, and that's super positive. I have talked to I talked to a CFO last summer, when I was at a meeting with one of our larger accounts, and I was like, "Great, awesome." I get a brief moment to chat with him, and so I wanna ask him, like, "Why do you think 1% for the planet is valuable?" And, like, without missing a beat, he said, 1% for the planet is core to our staff culture and engagement, which is core to our ability to succeed as a company. And this is a company that they use. One component of the 1% for the planet model is that you can allocate volunteer hours for part of your 1%. So volunteering with nonprofit partners. So they have a pretty active program of engaging their employees in selecting the nonprofits, putting in some volunteer hours there. So it is a core part of their culture. And he was just like, hands down, no hesitation. This is absolutely core to who we are. I've talked to another business who shared, and this gets a little bit back to my first point, but kind of stated differently. He said, 1% for the planet is the accountability that we aren't just doing initiatives and then moving on to the next thing. It's that we're
Mm.
making a long-term commitment. So say for a couple years, we're doing donations that are, focused on, watersheds, healthy watersheds in the area where our headquarters is. And then, we get to a point where, either for our own reasons or, because, success has been achieved, the land has been protected, we are done with that. It would be very easy without the 1% for the planet commitment to just sort of fade or say like, great, check, we did that. Whereas, 1% is always like, okay, what's going to happen next year? Where's the 1% going to go next year? So it does create this kind of through line for companies of accountability to values that don't just end when, there's a, kind of success in one project or just the completion of one project. And that I think is an important piece of it as well.
Mm. I think I also remember we met at Blue Earth Summit, and you said that a really important part of it is that it's 1% of revenue and not profit. Um, and I was interested in the reasoning behind that.
Yeah, and that does tap back into a little bit of what we were saying about like the tax piece because I think
Mm.
if it's 1% of revenue, like revenue is agnostic to whether you've had a good year or not. I mean, obviously more revenue drives a better year, but in any year that you make revenue, 1% of that is allocated. And so and it also, this taps into like the kind of financial discipline of like, if it's always 1% of revenue, your revenue is going to, fluctuate somewhat. You can control that to a certain degree. Lots of forces affect it that are outside of your control. we usually have, barring unexpected tariffs, a little more control over, some of our expense bases. So, revenue doesn't lie, and revenue is always there, again, whether you have more or less in the profit side of things. And I think it just ensures that commitment, whatever the weather.
Yeah. Um, can you give people a sense of the scale of the? I think you're on track to hit a very big number soon,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
like also the scale, but also how that's changed over time because 1% has been going for 25 years.
Yeah. So we are at about just shy of 5,000 members globally. We're in about 100 different countries. We're actually about 58% outside of the US. So love to dispel the perception that we're kind of US centric with a smattering elsewhere. It's quite different. Like, we really have a large global presence and operate accordingly. We have certified, so the key metric that we track, lots of other underlying metrics, but the key one we're sort of looking at is the certified impact. And so that's the certified 1% of revenue annually. And so, every member is giving their 1%, and they go through a certification at the end of each year. We track that certification, and so we're able to aggregate and report this certified impact on an annual and then a lifetime basis, so since we were founded. And so right now we have certified more than 820 million US dollars. We convert all currencies into US dollars for the purposes of this reporting. Um, and so we're on track to get to kind of a two-part goal, which is to hit our first billion in lifetime impact, and then to significantly accelerate to the next billion. So, in the scheme of, the billion is a big, beautiful number. Totally psyched about that, and love the way it's like the aggregate of all of this 1% giving, literally hundreds of thousands of donations over the years. And in, in terms of what we need to solve, there's, depending on sort of who you talk to, there's a multi-trillion dollar gap in what is needed to, fund climate solutions alone, much less like all the other things. So getting to the next billion faster is really important. And so that's, we're really looking at all the different ways that we can grow to do that. A couple of other interesting, just like stats about sort of the scale and scope of who we are. We're in about 65 different industries. So no more than 10% of our network is in any one of those industries. And, I think the big surprise for us, as well as most people we talk to, is that right now, the biggest industry or sector is professional services. I think most people think of 1% for the planet as very much like consumer products play, in that, you have a product, you put a logo on it, that's how it works. Really increasingly, and I think this is driven by consumers, we're seeing banks, insurance companies, um, uh, brand and marketing agencies, consultants, lawyers, people who don't have a product, but consumers are saying, I want to be able to kind of have confidence in everyone I'm working with, everyone I'm doing business with. Because for consumers, like we haven't really talked about that important part of our ecosystem, but consumers are the ones who are, saying and like voting with their dollars that, like, I want to put dollars into the sales of a company that's going to donate 1% to solutions, because then I get to be part of that. Because most people are not, big investors or big philanthropists. Most people are buying groceries and clothing and, insurance, and like trying to, make ends meet. And so for those dollars to have that power in addition to their buying power is really, really awesome.
Yeah, yeah, that's huge. So 820 million over in lifetime giving. And is there like a rough idea as to how that has changed over time? Because I think it's really like been exponential, right?
Yeah, it has accelerated. So, maybe the best way to kind of scale that is when I became CEO almost 11 years ago. Is that right? Yeah, almost 11 years ago. At that point, our membership we had about 1,000 members, and we were annually certifying about 16 million, and we had certified a total of about 100 million. Those are like rough numbers. So lifetime at that point, and that was at about 12 and a half years. So say half of our 25. I'm rounding a little bit, but I'm not off too far. So, at 12 and a half years of existence, we'd certified 100 million US dollars. Double that at almost 25 years, we're at 820 million US dollars. So, that's, kind of 8x plus in terms of we've done in that, second chunk. And by the time we get to a billion, it will be, closer to, 9x. And then, we want to I don't know yet. We don't have a number yet, but like really significantly X that as we move forward from there.
How have you, like in your 11 years as CEO, like that's a huge increase from 100 million to 820. How have you like created the conditions for that?
Yeah. I think some of the things that we've done is throughout the organization's lifetime, but we really doubled down on this in the last 10 years. We've really focused on brand building, which is not like what a lot of nonprofits talk about. We are set up as a nonprofit, but we really, had the understanding early that the 1% for the Planet brand really matters because it's part of how we kind of hold that whole ecosystem together. And so what the brand includes is, consumers are aware. And so we test our brand awareness. So there's pretty strong brand awareness in the key markets where we operate, and we always are kind of expanding where we test it. We're in about 8 countries now that we test it. But consumers are aware and have a positive purchase intent. And so that's good for them because they can feel like, great, I get to make choices with my purchasing dollars. It's great for companies because it's a good signal that like, okay, this matters. Like to, let's just use the language, to pay this tax annually has a value because there is evidence that consumers are aware and choose to purchase, products and services that have this logo. And we have some even more refined case studies that show, some increases in sales or increases in brand loyalty associated directly with 1% for the Planet activations. Additionally, our brand, is built around the trust in the partnerships between our members and our nonprofits. So that's also a component of it. So companies who increasingly are, it's really hard to figure out what to do in the impact space. And it's really understandable to feel like, oh my gosh, I could get burned if I make
Daunting.
the wrong choice. Yeah, like there's a lot to choose from, and it feels like it could go really wrong, and we could get burned. So,
High stakes,
we've
yeah.
developed a high degree of trust and credibility in our process. We have a amazing track record of companies giving to nonprofits and having amazing relationships and having the outcomes that they had hoped for. And so, that immediately reduces a barrier for companies. They're like, okay, this simplifies how I think about it. This gives me the confidence. So I think that brand building was a, really important piece of what we did. We also have just in, the sort of day in, day out ways that we on an annual basis are leaning into, built relationships. So like when I started, it wasn't uncommon for me to travel to an event where there might be 10 members, but we built those relationships, and our account managers were on the phone talking to members. And so I think we also just built community, and that has become, created some energy and magnetism. And we still lean into that. We host events, and then we support those events with really active communication. So I think we, built that. And then, I also have to like point to external factors. So like during this same period of time, there was a big uptick in and there's, a lot of great consumer data of consumers just getting more clear of like, hey, we want our purchasing dollars to go towards solutions. And that sort of drove more companies to have an interest in that and created a little bit of a cycle around that. And then, I think very interestingly, COVID ended up being, creating an uptick for us, like the kind of steepest upward curve, which we completely did not
Really?
expect. Yeah, because I thought like, who's going to give to an environment
Yeah.
focused effort when, this big health crisis is happening? And the best I can sort of figure out, there was some like, we finally have time to make these decisions, things like that. But, really, I think what it was the sort of big driver of that uptick was an awareness that like big global shocks
Mm.
happen really fast. And so
And can
climate
affect you.
change had been this like future existential threat, which we're not really wired to respond to. It was like out there, it was intellectual. At that point, it was like acknowledged, but it wasn't felt. And I
Mm.
think the like experience of a pandemic wrapping the globe in weeks was like, "Oh, okay, this can happen." So I think that was a factor too, and then it's been we've leveled off since then. Like the world has gotten interesting and different again, and it is I would say it is objectively a harder environment for companies to be making some of these choices right now, both economically, but also just some of the kind of political and cultural zeitgeist makes it has sort of upped the
Mm.
the fear and uncertainty factor around sort of how to make values-led choices, I think.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting because you know Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia, who created then with his business partner, 1% for the planet. Like, Patagonia is like pretty political and like isn't afraid to say like some pretty bold stuff. Like, what did they print in the board shorts? It was like vote out the assholes or something.
Yep. Yep, that's it.
um, and I'm interested in like the line that you walk compared to Patagonia because you've had a lot of conversations with Yvonne, and I guess there is there's a hell of a lot to learn, but like there's some convergence and some divergence in the line you've got to walk on this aspect.
Yeah, yeah, it's a really important question because he and his buddy Craig Matthews, the other founder, they created 1% for the Planet to be a movement builder. So essentially what drove them to have the idea of creating 1% was the awareness that what they were each doing with their companies was great. Like they were giving back, they were, becoming more activists. But to have individual companies doing this, they were like, it's not going to change things at scale. That's just going to be individual companies doing things. And so we need to create something that builds a movement that creates a way for many companies, every company everywhere to participate. And so, you know, as that plays out, your question is a really astute one because we have, we're deeply attached because we were founded by Patagonia, like it's part of our DNA, and their role in the movement is to be an N of one, to be a bold voice that's like printing things in board shorts that like most CEOs would never even say. And, they're memorializing it in their clothing and so much more. And our role is to be an N of many and to create a movement that can engage companies that are very different from each other, but that share this commitment to the planet. And so it's, it's worked well. And I think one of the things that we've really, and, I think part of our growth is, by creating our impact areas, by having clarity that each company chooses how they engage and what their story is. So they're all, our movement is unified under the 1% for the Planet brand, but it's like beautifully diverse within that because every company, even companies in the same industry, are choosing very different giving pathways and stories. And so, I think just by virtue of kind of time and the stories that we tell about our different members, it's pretty clear the point is not to be Patagonia, even though many companies are like that's what they aspire to. But the point is not to be Patagonia, to be like Patagonia, to do it the way Patagonia does it. The point is to see, oh, that's what it looks like to be wholehearted in your values. And so what we really want all of our companies to do is figure out what does that look like for them? What does it look like for a company that maybe has different political views than Patagonia, but still cares about planet and people, which is a truth. Like that's, it's truly a nonpartisan thing. What does it look like for them to be wholehearted around their values in the context of their 1%? And we see a lot of great examples of that.
Hmm. Um, you've sat down with. I've watched a few interviews where you and Yvonne have chatted. What are some things that you've learned from him?
I think I've learned, I see him, and he's, older now, like he continues to learn and continues to like explore ideas and continues to like, it seems to me, and I wouldn't at all profess to be the person who knows him best, but from what I've learned that he, you know, thinks deeply about ideas and goes and really explores them often in sort of public expression, and then may change, may shift, and is I think been pretty, um the like evolution of his thoughts has been the evolution of Patagonia and has been like public and visible. That said, I think there's some thoughts that have not changed, which is to not shy away from potential conflict, if it's what he believes in. So I think maybe that's like the biggest sort of gift that I have received from him and from his example, which is like the courage of convictions. And then I think the work I've had to do is again that like N of one versus N of many. Like I play a different role. And so like creating the space for many different like voices and points of view to come together is very different than like, leading the company in that way. So what does it look like to, have the courage of conviction in a very, very different space, has been
Mm,
the fun work that I get to do. And I think for me,
yeah.
the way that is translated is like I have a really strong belief in um, the opportunity of engaging every business everywhere and meeting them where they are and believing in the value of incremental change at scale as like aggregating to billions of dollars in impact.
Do you, you said incremental change, and I think some people are against like incrementalism, quote unquote.
Yep.
Um, what I feel like you're pretty. I mean, 1% for the planet is almost baked into the name, like the belief in that incremental improvements can make a huge impact over time. But like, do you think what's your stance on it? And like, do you think that it should be controversial to say that incrementalism is a good route?
Yeah, I love that you picked up on that. That's a good thing to dig into because it is an area where we will sometimes get challenged. The way I see it though is like if this isn't already clear from our conversation, I'll like say like I'm a both and person. I don't think in any way that a company saying, "Hey, we're going to do 1%" means that they're putting a cap on what they're going to do. They can do more and we see them doing more. So one, kind of way I sort of push back on those who say like incrementalism is not enough or incrementalism distracts us from doing more is to say like that's actually not what we see in practice. We see companies taking the step of 1%, and what it does is it gets them moving. It gets them, into action. And you know, my belief, again, like firmly backed up by the evidence that we see, is action drives more action. So when you
Mm.
start moving, you get to move more. Or like another way to look at it is if you take a step up on a ladder, you see the landscape differently. And so you can see opportunities that you didn't see when you were still standing at the ground floor. So then you might take a next step because you're like, oh, if we go here, we can do that. And so we see companies that will start at 1%, and it's oftentimes kind of their first step. And then they, like, oh, actually, we could eliminate. I see these companies in the 1% network that have eliminated plastic from their packaging. I'm going to talk to them and learn. And, we've had companies take this, like, go on this incredible journey. We're continuing to just certify that incremental 1%, but they're doing so much more. So that's one, like, pushback I would offer.
Mm.
The other is, our 820 million, soon to be a billion, soon to be billions is, um, that adds up. And so I think we're proof positive that, incremental, small actions, simple actions done repeatedly in community at scale. I mean, that's our theory of change. Simple actions done repeatedly in community are how we change the world. And, you know, if it was 2%, would that be more? If it was whole company, would that be more? Sure. But like, show me a movement that has been able to get companies to make massive changes at scale consistently over a period of more than 25 years. I don't know
Mm.
where it is. So I'm going to believe that let's, 1% A is not nothing. 1% of revenues is a big deal. So I want to like make sure that's really well understood in the conversation, because our companies certainly feel that like 1% of revenues, big deal. Um, and it adds up. And it's,
Mm.
if you get every business doing that, that's a lot of impact. And it doesn't put a ceiling on what they can do from there.
Do you think it's something that the sometimes the green world, or the world of, if you very simplify it, like normal businesses and green businesses, or people who are very like climate and sustainability conscious, I think there's a lot of like almost rock throwing at like standing at the border and being like, if you come in and you haven't got all of like your checks and balances done, then you're not allowed in. And I think that can be quite exclusionary, and it can stop a lot of people from wanting to cross that line to do anything. Do you feel like that's a kind of do you think that's happening? And do you see that, because you said you're the first step often? Do you see
Mhm.
that maybe companies are saying to you, "Oh well, we're not sure about all these other big actions, but we can do what and it's not small as you say, but we can go with you guys."
Yeah, I mean, we definitely there's a like spectrum of activism, and
Mm.
and I lead towards like we need all of it. I think we do need the voices that are saying like this is what could be possible, like this is the standard of kind of really changing things.
The Patagonias.
So yeah, exactly. We need that. Um, the My view and the role that we play, and I think again we need all of it, is to create that pathway. So like I'm a runner, so I like have like sports metaphor for it. Like basically, you know, w- if you say to everyone, regardless of their fitness, of their interest in running, whatever, the only thing the only way that you can legitimately engage is to run a marathon. You're going to have like 5 people run that marathon. Everyone else is gonna be like, "Yeah, oh, well, forget it, like, that I can't do that, so that's not for me." Whereas if instead you say, "Hey, the kind of the ultimate race is the marathon, but, like, the way you get to a marathon is you start running. So let's just start that practice." And I would say, like, 1% for the planet, and maybe this is, like, pushing the metaphor too far, is like we're the 5K, 10K. It's legit. You have to train for it. You have to put some practice in and some effort in, and it's not nothing, and it gets you fitter and fitter the more that you do it. But we're not saying you have to be at the marathon level in order to count. So we're getting, hundreds of thousands of people, at that level of kind of fitness. So I'll
Mm.
stop that metaphor there, but I do think that that's important, because I think when that sort of kind of rock throwing at the people who are the companies who aren't perfect, and we'll hear that, we will get pushback sometimes, like, how can you engage with XYZ company? And it's like, well, if we can move them from here to here, I'm all for transitioning them. Like, I
Mm.
100% believe in that. We reserve the right, if a company is like, if it's if the impacts are too significant, and the scale of the 1% is too small in the larger scheme of things, those companies aren't coming to us. ExxonMobil has not been, they were not the one who called
They're
earlier
not
to
knocking down your
us.
door.
Yeah, so but I would talk to them, like, I would absolutely, like, because I would wanna learn, like, what are the changes that you can make? What are the ways that a 1% could be, part of a transition? And then we would have to figure out, like, how would that fit? What would we gain? What would we lose? Because that's part of building a movement, is figuring out how do you maintain, momentum. But like talking to and engaging with, very different companies is, part of how we do that learning.
Mm. Yeah, I think a lot of people wouldn't be brave enough to say that they would pick up the phone to ExxonMobil. So yeah, who knows whether they would be like the purposes that they would be doing it for, but like at least I spoke to someone last week, Mark Shaler, and he was like, at least if I'm in the boardroom, I can say this to the people directly there rather than the people outside the building shouting it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I would say like our position, how we would enter into a conversation is like, we probably wouldn't be in the boardroom, but we would be creating like productive learning conversation. So maybe we'd be like sidebarring, beside the protest to say, hey, we have the same expectations for change as everything that they're shouting about, but we actually have the, kind of practical focus of like, what are actually the ways that you could make those changes? And that would be the conversation that I would be in. And I do think really like naming that like sort of pragmatism is really at the core of who we are, is like, we do want every business everywhere to be engaging in this model, because we so believe that, that kind of fundamental simple action, not only in and of itself adds up to significant change at scale, but it also is such a stepping stone to so much more than that, and that the relationships within the community, start to create it. So effectively, one of the things that, you could say is that our movement is creating, is an economy, because every single member of the 1% for the Planet community is doing this 1%. Their P&Ls are a little different than every other company because they have this 1%. And so that's, we are an economy, or we are a form of capitalism. And so we want that to be what is adopted everywhere.
Interesting. We've got some interesting marketing slogans. We are an economy. We're a tax. We're a running group.
Yeah.
There's some fun ones in there.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure how well they would all sell, but I think they're useful for sort of thinking about it.
They might not get approved. What do you mentioned about your theory of change, and I thought that was interesting. I came across the statement recently because I was speaking to a climate psychologist, or someone in the climate psychology world, and in your experience, you mentioned about the people you're speaking to are maybe at the start of their journey. What do you find is your mix, or maybe your personal mix, but also like 1%'s like mix of what compels people to change? Because the carrot and the stick are like, both have their arguments in this debate, but like certain, people believe that they need to be used in very different amounts. And what would you say your like?
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned psychology, because I actually sometimes, I know I'm, leading an environmental nonprofit. Our movement is an environmental movement, but I think a lot of what I actually end up thinking about, and a lot of what we're doing, is actually kind of addressing the psychology of change. So, I think that's a really important thing to name. And it was in that spirit that we articulated this theory of change, because we realized like that is our offering to businesses, is that we, kind of take what is complex, overwhelming, scary, maybe just like a not known environment. Like, I'm creating widgets. That's my business. I don't know about this other space, but I care about it. So what we're trying to do is, and that all of that creates psychological barriers. Like, I don't want to screw up. Like, I don't want to get, called out. I don't want to do the wrong thing. I don't want to have uncertainty. And so I think what we're trying to do is, and what's embedded in that theory of change is like, hey, it's a simple action. You get to do it again and again and again. So you have opportunities to learn. It's part of a community. Other people are doing this. Like, this is a thing. And it adds up. And like, hey, look, last year we certified 140 million US dollars. It adds up. So it does matter. So, because that we also will hear like, oh, well, it's too small. So interestingly, and that's like an interesting psychology, is like, too small is still more than nothing. But a lot of times, because people are like, it needs to be the big swing, they end up actually doing nothing for a long time. And in my mind, it's like, why don't you add up some increments in there and get to that bigger thing? So I do think the theory of change has been a really important way that we, um, kind of create understanding and space for, what we're doing, and sort of refute that sort of argument against instrumentalism or incrementalism, um, and just like create that understanding of like, it does work. It does create
Mm.
change scale.
Yeah, it's really interesting the mental hurdles that people work themselves into with either it's not big enough or it's too big. And I feel like it kind of sits at that like medium level, which is very welcoming in. Um,
And I wanna just quickly to really emphasize, like, I don't judge that, like, I get that. That is, like, a core human psychology, like, we want to drive uncertainty to 0 when we can. We want to get it right, and I appreciate that, and I love that, and so, we're really, without judging, just trying to like create understanding that, yeah, like there's a lot of things that make it hard to do this. So we want to invite you into a space where you can be bold and you can do so with confidence, and we're with you. The community is with you.
mm. I'm interested. We posted about our talk on LinkedIn, and a few people asked some questions. And one interesting one was about trends that you're seeing over time, maybe as your time as CEO, um, and like the reasons that maybe people are signing up, or just more broadly market trends. Like, are there any? You mentioned about COVID, which was a really interesting one. Are there any ones that have really taking you by surprise, or you think people may not expect or may not have heard of?
I think one that I mentioned is just the like increase in sort of non-product consumer product companies
Mm,
joining. When I started, it really was like largely, and in fact, we talked about ourselves as like we're a CPG play. Like we use that language. And now like very much, we have shifted. So our top single sector is professional services. So I think that's one trend. And what that tells me about what the larger trend is that consumers are, getting more sort of complex in their thinking about like how they want to be allocating their dollars across, all of the different ways, not just the shampoo they buy or the, food that they put in their fridge. So I think that's an interesting trend, and a really positive one. Um, I would say um, we've seen we've seen trends, and I think we actually have an opportunity to do more like storytelling around this of like where companies are allocating their 1%. So when I started, we used to categorize, we had a sort of traditional like resource-based way that we categorized impact. So it was like land, water, wildlife, pollution, um, climate. And it was, then that was fine, but we realized it was, ultimately we switched to our 4 impact areas because we were more interested in kind of articulating both the solution areas and more like connective tissue between, when is climate also a, wildlife issue or things like that, and it was just a little too segmented. But like when I first started, the land category was where the majority of member funding was going, and now I think last year it was climate adaptation, so that's a big, shift,
what does that
and
mean if someone? Sorry, just on that point on climate adaptation. What does that mean if someone hasn't heard the term?
climate adaptation is a sort of broad set of work, but kind of a specific element of, overall climate funding. So it that shows up in different ways. It could be things like, on the ground investment in wetlands to make a community that's coastal have more kind of fundamental resiliency. So it's like able to adapt to a changing climate. Um, so that's like just one example. So it would be things like that where there's an acknowledgement of climate change, and, another kind of side of climate work would be like climate mitigation. So how do we like address and try to slow down the progression of climate change. Climate adaptation is recognizing that we're already seeing those impacts. So what are some of the ways that we need to adapt, not just to protect human communities, but, say like wildlife corridors, if migration patterns are being forced to change because of changing weather patterns and changing climate patterns, like how do we create adaptation for that? So broadly, that's what that means. And it would invite
Mm.
anyone to go to our website and just, click through to learn more.
Yeah. Um, and another thing that I think is interesting, unrelated, but is like how you, and I guess it's kind of to the political points that we were speaking about earlier, but like, the US at the moment is like, and all over the world isn't very favorable or thinking very kindly of like, green initiatives or sustainability. Are you finding uh like that difficulty showing up in your members or the signups or what they're saying or in your work as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely there's a chilling effect when the, political or economic environment is not conducive to either the like financial flows or the kind of value statement. But a few interesting things that we've like observed that we take as, really good clear signs of the truly common ground of environment is our current member pool has retained at a really high level this year, both in the US and outside of the US, which isn't to say that people haven't felt the sting of tariffs and the uncertainty of the economy or, maybe shifted the ways in some of the ways in which they're talking about their commitments, but they're staying the course. So we take that as a really good sign. Additionally, what's been, really interesting and valuable for us is when we kind of shifted from that resource-based allocation of our impact description to the 4 impact areas that I mentioned, like we were just going for like plain spoken language that was, kind of descriptive of what was happening on the ground and, where we landed with just economies, resilient communities, rights to nature, and conservation and restoration has created a framework that is works really well today in the same way that it worked really well 5 years ago. And so I think, that's been, helpful because we're seeing companies that are just like continuing to figure out what do we want to do in the world and what's the plain language that we want to use to describe what we're doing. So like resilient communities, that can be tied to, climate efforts. It can be tied to, various different like community-based kind of work where people and communities are engaging with the landscape. That whole package, is a set of work that seems to navigate not for any like there was no like artful effort at like hiding in plain sight. It was just like this is the work that we know needs to happen. And so I think I'll use that to just like pull through part of what is true for 1% for the planet, which is that we get asked a lot, like, how are you dealing with this particular year in the US and in the world? Like, the US isn't the only country that's experiencing a kind of um, crazy year. Maybe ours is a little more amplified, but like a crazy year politically. I mean, there's it's an interesting time in the world. And we were built for this. So we were founded in 2002 and the movement that we've been focused on we've always sort of understood it as there's the nonprofit sector, there's the business sector, there's government. And if you look at it as a pie, like the lines between those slices of the pie are going to be shifting all the time. And what 1% for the planet is always there to do is to say, there are resources driven in the marketplace that can drive positive impact outside of the marketplace. And, again, back to our conversation earlier, like also within the marketplace as our members start to take additional steps. So government's going to play more or less of a role. And our model continues to be a way that people can drive change. And so I think as we sort of play through this year, I think we're, just really seeing the ways in which that's fundamentally true as we create this pathway that can be effective regardless, or
Yeah.
regardless, but like in any context.
Yeah, is a lot more resilient than relying on political or
Yeah.
economic wins. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I'm interested to ask you what question you wish people would ask you more often. Maybe professionally, like the companies you work with, but also more broadly, like at a dinner table, for example.
That is a really excellent question itself. What comes to mind for me, because I generally feel like I get asked a lot of questions, which I love, and that I appreciate that people don't usually sugarcoat it. So I feel like appropriately challenged on a regular basis. But I would I think the question that would be interesting to me and that I would certainly love to have more conversation about is what are assumptions that we're making about capitalism that aren't true that we could change. So, like for example, we talked about this a little bit earlier. I'm just super interested in assumptions about like wealth accruing to founders and wealth accruing to owners. And I don't. That's not to say that the generators of amazing ideas and the who have done a huge amount of work should not be compensated for that. But it gets out of whack. And so I think when can our system include a concept of enough that enables us to distribute wealth differently? Because I think that would just have such a remarkable ripple effect. Like, wealth inequality as a driver for much of the challenge we currently experience, I think is true. And I think it's something we need to address. And again, in the sort of opportunities within capitalism, there's some amazing ways that we can address that. And so but a lot of times people have assumptions like, well, you can't do that. Capitalism is evil and it doesn't allow for that. And it's like, well, we have Patagonia that's, allocated ownership to a purpose trust, essentially like for the planet. I met an amazing CEO of a company in Colorado who her mission is to create 1,000 millionaires, and this is a very like industrial company, but she's created this employee ownership, profit sharing model, and she's like, I want my like floor workers. They do industrial cleaning to become millionaires. And they should. They're doing the work. They're generating the opportunity for wealth. I'm good. And if they do better, I do better too. So like it works. So and I have other examples of that, but it's not the norm. So I think that's the question is like what assumptions are we limiting ourselves by that we could actually think about differently? Love to have that conversation.
Wow. We should have started there.
Yeah.
That's such a good question. Are there any other assumptions that I'm so intrigued now? Are there any other assumptions that you think that we should? Because I think it's a really interesting debate, but like the question of like how much do we need to change capitalism / throw it in the bin / make some tweaks around the edges, and like what other things you think? Because that's a really cool example, like that the industrial company, like 1,000 millionaires instead of like 1 billionaire, and
Mhm. Yeah.
yeah. Are there any others that come to mind?
Um, Maybe like what are we really afraid of would be another question. And that gets like a little more, but like when I think about, um, say if you're afraid of taking a stand, like what are you actually afraid of? And this is not to say like, I don't get afraid of that sometimes. So I'm like, there's no like holier than thou in this question at all. But when I try, like at times when I'm like feeling like I'm scared of doing something, I try to ask myself because when I do, it usually like provokes some good thought. It's like, what am I actually afraid of? Am I afraid people won't like me? Am I afraid I'm going to get it wrong? Or like, is there a more substantial fear? Because both of those fears, like, if we want to change our world, if we want to create something better, we have to understand what risks we're actually facing and what risks we're willing to take. And I think when we say fear, there's often a like, oh yeah, we're fear, but like, what are we actually afraid of? And is it a fear that we need to lean into and say like, okay, I see you, but I'm gonna keep going because I can handle that? Or is it a more, fear that, and there are true things that we should be afraid of, like if there's, risk to our workers or risk to, the ability or viability, long-term viability of the company. But I'm interested in that question because each of us in our different seats probably have lots of instances on a daily or a bigger basis when we are either sort of held back or we lean into opportunities despite fear. And so I think that would be an interesting question.
I think there's a Stoic saying that we suffer in imagination more than in reality, which I
Hmm.
think is really applicable, and it's really true. I
Yeah,
certainly feel it, and I think
yeah,
a lot of people do.
yeah, absolutely.
Um, is there a question that you're kind of fed up of answering or fed up of being asked, like one that everyone asks, and you kind of internally you like roll your eyes?
Um, I mean, I'll say this, although I also always really like answering it because it gives me a good chance to sort of say what I think. I think the questions that are either is like, is 1% enough or is 1% too much? Because we will get both of those. And again, I don't like it's really important to be able to articulate that. So maybe that's a non-answer to your question because I actually really don't mind those questions. So if you're out there and like you have those questions, bring it. But there is like a element of that that kind of gets to the incrementalism. And I always want to answer that question. And I have such a strong belief of like, you know, okay, if the alternative is 5 people running the marathon instead of millions of people training and for and successfully running the 5K and 10K, like, to me, it's, like, just so self-evident of, like, of course we need to do this, and it doesn't mean that more people aren't therefore able to run the marathon. So I do have a little bit of fire in my belly around that one. But by the same token, anytime I can, like, answer with fire in my belly, I'm happy to get that out there. So, like, ask the question.
Yeah, ask the question and be prepared for the answer.
Yeah, and don't be afraid of me to the fear point,
Yeah.
like, I'm not judging you, I appreciate the question, it is something that I'm very I do have clarity on, whereas there are a lot of other things that I'm still figuring out too, and so
Mm,
I also like the questions because oftentimes that's, like, how I hear myself think, and I'm able to sort of figure out, "Oh, this is what our theory of change is." For example, like, that's how that kinda honed was, like, having enough conversations where I realized I'm not settled on this, and then realizing, like, "Oh, yeah, this is where it lands."
yeah. Kate, I'm not going to take any more of your time. I've really, really enjoyed this so much. Where can
Likewise.
people where can people find out more about 1% for the Planet and maybe join or send this to a friend if they're interested?
Yeah, so our website, 1%fortheplanet.org, if you Google 1% for the Planet, you should find it, or 1% for the Planet all spelled out in letters.org. And, our website has a lot of information about those impact areas. There's a membership page you can click right through, and there's for those who are interested in definitely joining. We welcome you. There's a simple join form that doesn't commit you to anything, but it'll get you immediately into a conversation with one of my awesome team members. And then I would also invite people to connect with me on LinkedIn. I do respond to, questions there. So, and that's like Kate Williams. You can find me, just search me there,
We'll link
and
it.
be happy to connect and talk there.
Nice. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.